the promises that we make at election time keep getting bigger and bolder and bigger and bolder. But voters keep telling us that they are getting less and less from us. And if the gap between the promise and the delivery gets too wide, then people lose faith. And they don't just lose faith in the party of government, they lose faith in the whole democratic system. So I ask again, what will voters do if elected politicians keep letting them down? Truth is, I don't know, and I don't particularly want to find out, but I'm pretty certain it is not something that any of us will relish. Now, there's been plenty of analysis as to what happened at the last general election, and I'm sure there'll be plenty more to come, but the headline is not hard to see or understand. We made promises, both explicit and implicit, and delivery fell short, way short. So I intend to make the case today that our promises to the electorate need to be more realistic and our delivery much more effective. Now, Labour started really badly. It was going to put up the growth they were going to stimulate, the reforms that they were going to make, all turned to ash in their mouths. And the anger of the British people, the anger that they feel at this betrayal, is palpable. And as Conservatives, we shouldn't kid ourselves that they've forgiven us yet, because they really haven't. And that perhaps explains why a number of other parties, smaller parties, are doing very well in the polls. And they're optimistic, I have no doubt, cocky even. But their optimism will be short-lived if they follow the same pattern. And as it currently stands, that is exactly what they're doing. Promising easy fixes to difficult problems. But the thing is, easy fixes for difficult problems don't exist. Because if they did, the problems wouldn't be difficult, would they? And it's tempting, dangerously tempting, to try and outbid populists with even bolder promises. But voters have grown weary of bold words without competent action. And failing to deliver on our promises is what got us kicked out of government, and I don't think we should make the same mistake again. Now, public service should be driven by a genuine desire to make a difference. And I entered politics to get things done. And yet, we now live in an era of politics as performance art. The I fought the system narrative gets a lot more applause than the quiet, unglamorous work of actually getting things done. And I'll give you an example. Just let's look at a couple of local government stories that we've seen recently. A tale of two counties, as it were. Both reform-run county councils. In Warwickshire, a row over flags turned into a circus of grandstanding. The council leader issued a stern directive, bypassing any kind of decision-making process. The chief exec of that council said the leader didn't have the power to direct council officials in that way. Reform HQ defined it as a coup, as an example of a defiant deep state. In Leicestershire, they had a meeting of the executive, they passed a resolution, and they changed their flag policy. Boring, but effective. And which one of these two reform councils are reform headquarters most proud of? Which one got the coverage? Which one got the accolades? The one that had the row and didn't get the result. And it's not about being a slave to process, it's about understanding that delivery requires discipline. But that is, of course, at odds with a populist sales pitch. Because in their minds, fighting the system is more important than getting a result. But who loses out when the battle is more important than the victory? the very people who need politicians to get results on their behalf. And it's not just bad government, it's bad politics. And with everything that's going on, both domestically and internationally at the moment, we don't have the luxury of bad government. So how do we do it differently? Well, my proposition is that there are two ingredients to do things differently. First of all is honesty, and the second is accountability. So the first ingredient, as I say, is about being honest about the problems and the challenges that we face, and realistic about how we deal with them. Let me give you a few examples of the honest conversations that I think we need to have on three issues. There are others, but on three issues: on the economy, on immigration, and on housing. So on the economy, we are living well beyond our means. Taxes are unsustainably high in both absolute terms and compared to our international competitors. The national debt is forecast to hit 270% of GDP over the next 40 to 50 years. And you can't tax and subsidise your way to growth. So we have to unleash private enterprise. But we've become ultra risk averse, which means we're too highly regulated, and that stifles growth. But saying that the government should regulate less rather than more isn't an easy conversation to have. Because despite what I would wish to be true, the British people quite like a bit of regulation. They think it protects them and doesn't cost them anything. And often case, both of those assumptions are wrong. So we have to reduce the size of the state. But we've seen in Parliament the huge lack of appetite there is for spending cuts. So taxes remain high, or indeed are going to increase, driving away investors and entrepreneurs, a disincentive to work, a vicious cycle, and we have to be honest about that. On immigration, levels are still too high. Now, I'm very proud of the work that I did to cut the levels of net migration by half, but the numbers are still too high. But we also have to recognise that as a society, as an economy, we have become addicted to low-skilled immigrant labour. Health, social care, agricultural processing, cab drivers, cleaners, late-night kebab delivery riders. I don't see very many Brits doing those jobs. And if we don't want those things to suddenly stop, and if we don't want to keep importing foreign workers to do those jobs, we have to get the millions of Brits who have opted out of the employment market back to work. But we currently see Labour, the Lib Dems, the Greens, and Reform dodging that truth and outbidding each other to try and buy popularity with increased welfare spending. But as Kemi said in her speech last week, this cannot go on. We have got to reduce and rebalance the welfare system. We have got to cut the size of the state, and we have got to be honest about the choices that we'll have to make to do that. And if we as politicians duck those difficult choices, the bond markets will do it for us, and the results will be unplanned and brutal. And on housing, if we want young people to have a realistic chance to having a home of their own, and we should, we need to build more homes. And if we don't help people get homes, we shouldn't be surprised if they stop voting for us. But that means a reboot of the sclerotic planning system. It means making the case for home building to the people who already have homes. Making sure they understand that it is in their interest to say yes to new neighbours rather than to say no. And that isn't easy, and it probably won't be popular in the very short term. But it needs to be done. But why make these difficult choices when it's so much easier to blame the system? And that is the go-to excuse of populist politicians, to rage against the machine, to pretend these difficult choices and trade-offs don't exist, and that the simple answer, the easy solution, is being blocked by the blob. I have lost count of the number of political gurus who said we should smash the system and start again from scratch. Tempting though that may be, it is totally unrealistic. Because all we need to do to deliver that is mobilise the alternative, anti-woke, right-wing civil service that's waiting in the wings to take things over when the civil service that we currently have is got rid of. Simple. But it's also a fantasy. It's a complete nonsense. It's excuse-making and it's weak. So, how do we drive delivery with the system and the officials that we've currently got? Well, my hypothesis, as I say, is that delivery requires accountability. And that's what voters demand, the ability to hold someone to account for the decisions that they make in the name of the voters and on their behalves. So Brexit, which was often talked about as a sovereignty question, was in reality an accountability question. And I'm going to quote someone that is not often quoted by Conservative politicians. Tony Benn, or as I like to call him, Sir Anthony Benn. Because he asked 5 key questions. What power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you use it? To whom are you accountable? And crucially, how do we get rid of you? And these questions do not just apply to supranational bodies. They also apply at home too. And interestingly, voters feel that these questions are not currently being answered. Again, slipshod gurus in the political sphere tell us that ministers are powerless. Well, they're not. Ministers are powerful if they choose to use that power. But too often they delegate that power in the mistaken belief that doing so shields them from blame or from accountability. It doesn't. There are between 300 and 600 quangos, arm's length bodies, delivery bodies, etc. It's really not easy to get an accurate figure. And no matter how many quangos exist, the NHS is still the responsibility of the Secretary of State for Health. And to be fair to Wes Streeting, he has started to try and scrape away some of the quangos in the health system. But there's still much, much more to do. When I was Home Secretary, I recognised that if crime went up, I would carry the can. Even though as Home Secretary, I'm not responsible for any police forces in the country. And the theme of this cloud of quangos is that instead of clear decisions from elected leaders, we retain a tangle of quangos, commissioners, panels, advisory bodies, all making decisions, almost none of whom have been voted for, and none of whom can be voted out. And that's not leadership, that's an abdication. We must shoulder our share of the blame for not tackling this problem, and in some cases indeed making it worse. But the government must keep looking at where decision making really lies, right across the Whitehall system and beyond. And if power lies where accountability does not, it has to be changed. And that means cutting quangos and ministers making decisions and being held accountable for those decisions. Because a disconnect between decision making and accountability not only introduces moral hazard, it ultimately erodes the very institutions upon which we rely. Because once politicians have been punished at the ballot box, who becomes the next target of public anger? And the responsibility lies with us as legislators to fix it. And fixing it requires a mission. Now, Keir Starmer talks a lot about mission. He uses it to sound dynamic and tough. But he doesn't really understand what the word means. Now, as many of you will know, I've spent a long but unglorious parallel career in the reserve forces. And I was taught mission command. And I was taught that mission command requires parameters, it requires an action verb, and it requires a unifying purpose. And mission in a political context should be a way of unifying and coordinating ministerial decisions. But more importantly, having a clear mission prevents civil servants from instructing ministers when it's the job of ministers to to instruct civil servants. Labour wasted their time in opposition. That much is clear. Their plan, not even a mission, not really even a plan, was just to be not the Tories. And their lack of plan, their lack of mission, is why they in government are implementing a raft of civil service proposals that we rejected when we were in government. That's how, for example, just to take one, they ended up cutting winter fuel payments and then U-turning it less than a year later. That lack of leadership, that lack of discipline leads to an erosion of trust. And civil servants are there to serve, clues in the name. But to serve, they need direction. Ministers must set the course, set the standards, and hold officials to account. And officials, despite the caricatures, will respond. And I know because I've done it. I cut net migration in half at the Home Office. I reset UK foreign policy when I was Foreign Secretary. I tightened and cut waste in our overseas aid spending. And I know something. Civil servants abhor a vacuum, and they will make decisions if their ministers don't or won't. But they will also respond to clear, unambiguous, and consistent instructions. Usually. And for those who don't respond to those instructions, then a career in the civil service probably isn't for them. So where does that leave us? It leaves us needing to build a culture of delivery, not a culture of political performance. A culture that recognises that good politics isn't about sounding righteous, it is about being effective. A culture that doesn't seek applause or symbolic gestures, but is driven by results and hard choices. And that means taking responsibility, not blaming the system, not blaming others, not blaming officials, not outsourcing decisions, and certainly not offering voters simplistic, undeliverable promises that in our hearts we must know we cannot keep. The public want leadership. They want seriousness. Ultimately, they want results. And they are watching us now more clearly than perhaps ever before. We don't need a revolution, we need a restoration. A restoration of competence, of delivery, and of trust. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah, great. Thank you, James, a really enlightening and interesting speech. There were so many themes that I would be keen to pick up on before we open up to the audience. Firstly, let's just talk a little bit about reform, because they are on the top of the agenda, both on the left and the right. Both parties really kind of existentially concerned about the threat of reform. How big a problem is this specifically to the Conservative Party? And why is it that groups of voters are rejecting mainstream politics in the Conservative Party for a kind of populist right politics, both here and obviously what's also happening abroad as well?
Well, that last point you made, I think, is absolutely key. This is not a uniquely British problem. Sorry. Move around here. I don't know if you pay cheaper tickets to have, or perhaps more expensive tickets to have marvellous, thank you. So this is not a uniquely British problem. I was speaking with an ambassador of a good friend and near neighbour in Europe, who was speaking in very concerned terms about the rise of the populist left and the populist right in their country. And frankly, I'm not going to name which country. It doesn't matter, because we're seeing this right across Europe. It seems to be a feature now of mature democracies, particularly across Europe and North America, this polarisation of politics. I think that the underlying symptoms we talked about are the same, which is, as I said, this disconnect between promise and delivery. And I think the challenge that we've got is that we want to grab the attention of the voters, we want to grab the minds of the voters, so we're incentivised to give more and more compelling promises. But the problem is, of course, that the more you do that, as I say, that gulf between promise and delivery gets wider and wider, and people look at alternatives. So they kicked us out of office, and Labour got in. Labour then, in my mind, completely unnecessarily, first job in government, they came to the dispatch box and they said, "Oh, we're going to fill this completely fictional black hole in the finances. We're going to do all this. We're going to smash the gangs. We're going to do all this." They made a whole load of very, very big promises and are failing on each and every one of them. So voters are grumpy with us. They're becoming increasingly grumpy with Labour. I don't think they're taking the Lib Dems particularly seriously as a party of national government. And so they're turning now to reform. And they're turning to reform. But reform are, as I say, reform are doing what I think is the cardinal sin, which is making these big, big, big promises, which they're already in local government where they're starting to run things, falling short. So my real worry is if voters have run through the list of political parties and gone overpromised, underdelivered, overpromised, underdelivered, overpromised, underdelivered, overpromised, underdelivered, there's none left, well, let's just smash things up and see what happens. And we think we're immune to that in the UK, and I hope we are, but I just don't want to take a chance.
And I mean, you clearly point to a real problem, which is that voters don't feel that political parties are delivering for them. They don't feel that they're meeting their promises. But some of those prescriptions you talked about would have felt very similar to how, for example, David Cameron government would have approached kind of stepping up to govern. Set really clear mission and purpose, treat the civil servants well, but make sure you're really holding them accountable. Does the prescription you're talking about address what has changed in the last 20 years of politics? Is it radical enough? The right is saying, the far right is saying, smash the system. Is the centrist party saying reform the system? Is the reform that you're talking about here radical enough to deal with the scale of the challenge?
Look, it's not just populist right, it's populism. The smash the system is an excuse. It's an easy way of ducking the big and difficult questions. If you took, I think metaphorically, it's always fun. I think metaphorically, if I were a Formula 1 driver, and pick any mixed race, good-looking Formula 1 driver at random, have that person look like, and you're on the radio to the pit lane, and you say, "I need to come in because I'm a couple of hundred seconds off the pace. I'm not feeling on the accelerator. And the pit lane said, "We're going to strip the engine and rebuild the engine mid-race." You would say, "I'm sorry, that's nonsense. What I need you to do is make that like pit lane tweak to give me back that extra 100 for a second of acceleration on the straight." And they go, no. We're going to smash the car to pieces and we're going to redesign a fundamentally different car. Everyone would look at that and go, "I'm sorry, that's nonsense. You don't have the luxury mid-race of starting again from scratch. You've got to work with what you've got and you've got to make those incremental improvements." And to switch that across to politics, as I say, when people turn around and say, "Oh, these fifth columnists in the civil service, got to get rid of all of them." Oh, really? Okay. Hands up who knows a bunch of, as I say, anti-woke, right of centre, maybe Tory reform-leaning civil servants just kicking their heels, going, "Oh, I'm really desperate to run a government department, but these other civil servants are doing it. I'm just waiting in the wings." They're not there. You've got to work with what you've got. And you talk about whether it's David Cameron. My inspirations for leadership tend to be back further in time politically and in the contemporary military, which is another group of people I know. You get the soldiers you get, and you make them good soldiers. That's the job of officers. Same is true of ministers in the civil service. And Margaret Thatcher, she was a revolutionary, as close to the conservative revolutionary as you get. She didn't scrap the civil service. And this was a much, much, much more traditional, inflexible civil service than we have now. You work with what you've got. Good leaders work with the tools that they've got. And I think it's an excuse when people turn around and say, oh, I can make your life better if only you let me completely rebuild the whole of the British governmental system on the fly in one go. It's nonsense, unrealistic, and should be discounted.
I'm going to come to questions in a minute, so get your questions ready. Final one from me. So say we accept entirely the premise of the delivery point. I still worry, I mean, your point about let's not get bogged down in performance, bitter politics, and, you know, that worries me. And it worries me because I worry that the rules of the game have fundamentally changed because of the media landscape. So there's a journalist in the US called Criticises who's written a book about the change in the media landscape, which is to say we're now all in a fight constantly for attention, and politics is competing with literally everything else on a set of platforms that are completely transformed. So to give you a tangible example, I was speaking to a pollster recently about the recent Polish election. There were 1.5 million swing voters. We're going to turn the election. If you looked at where they were getting their news in the last weeks up until the election, it was, well, majority was on Twitter, TikTok, social media, and 80% of the content that they were seeing through that was from the far right populist content, right? And so if we continue in the centre of politics to basically try and play on the old set of rules, which is stand up on the BBC, you know, hope that gets through to the people we need to see that, to persuade, I worry that we continue to see a whole swathe of the landscape that is influencing voters to those who are willing to grab attention. So is the recipe really delivery plus responsible performance, and how do we get that responsible performance right?
So you mischaracterised what I was saying. I wasn't saying that we shouldn't perform. I wasn't implying that we shouldn't communicate. Delivery is not the only thing. You've got to deliver. You've got to be seen to be delivering. The point I'm making is, if presented with a choice between performative non-delivery and delivery, I think you should always choose delivery. I went into the last leadership election being described as, was it centrist, or I think in the old days they would have described it as a Tory whip, which, like, that was news to me. I mean, absolutely news to me. I mean, I was the one standing up saying we need to double, pretty much double defence spending and cut the welfare state, and that made me a raving lefty, but so be it. But the point one of the points that I've made is that there was lots and lots of talk about cutting net migration, and I actually cut net migration, and yet I was the one being described as a bit of a Tory wet or a centrist or whatever. I halved net migration. And if you give me the choice to say, right, James, there are two ways you can be Home Secretary. You can scream into the void, you can blame the officials, you can say this stuff can't be done, they are preventing me doing what you want. Option one, very formative, headline grabbing. Or option two, halving net migration. I did choose to halve net migration. And I would do the same in a heartbeat. Now I like to think that had we had more time in government, I could have actually made the case compelling on those social media platforms that I actually deliver, and therefore you should give me more opportunity to deliver. And that's the point I'm making.
Great. So let's take some questions. Camilla?
Hello. Camilla Tomley. I'm going to use two mics, one for us and one for you, if you don't mind. Camilla Tomley here with Tim Stanley for the Daily Tea podcast at the Telegraph. Do you still harbour leadership ambitions? And I ask that because you've mentioned in the conclusion of your speech the importance of strong leadership, but not actually linked that to Kenny Babcock. And the previous intervention that we've heard from you in the last few months has been to actually go against her claim that we should cancel net zero by 2050.
Can I do that, or is that okay? Or do you want to do that straight off the bat?
Let me do that straight off the bat. Camilla, you need to read the speech that I gave. And I know you guys wrote up that was a big attack on net zero, but a couple of points. The speech wasn't about net zero. I never even mentioned net zero. But, you know, Well, in fact, getting away with a good headline. So, and I've said this privately, I've said this publicly, and I said this when I got knocked out of the leadership. A number of people came up to me, even before the competition had finished, saying, oh, you've got to get yourself ready, da da da. And I said, look, we have got to get out of this habit of cycling through leaders in the hope that ditching this one and picking a new one will make life easy for us. I said that at the time, I say it still, I still mean it. And also, again, I've said this to people publicly, if you watch someone stick the knife in the back of the current leader, and then that person says, do you want to stand where the current leader just stood? And I'm like, what, where the knives are out? That's not such a compelling thing. We've got to stop, and again, it kind of links back to the point I made in the speech. We've got to stop grasping for these easy solutions. Oh, a new leader, that will solve all our problems. Well, you know, we tried that a number of times in the last government. It did not end well. And I can't remember who said it, it's probably apocryphal, but you know, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. We have been, is it swipe left or swipe right? I'm happily married, so I don't know which way the apps work. But whatever the equivalent is, that kind of like, yeah, try again, yeah, try again, yeah, try again. If we keep doing that, we shouldn't be surprised if we keep getting the same result. Last time I checked, the result was not what we wanted, so maybe let's not do that. Sorry.
No, I'm going to take a couple of questions. The lady at the back there. Is the microphone coming?
Hi, I'm Anna Murphy from S-Curve Economics, and the question I've got is, you've had a few different proposals for civil service reform to improve delivery. So you've got Michael Barber, who ran a delivery unit, saying, okay, we need clear accountability, clear monitoring processes, and really good relationship management with civil servants, which is very much grounded in his Quaker background and being very careful with conflict resolution. And then you have Dominic Cummings saying, no, we need to really streamline, we need to use technology better, we need to pay people more, and take much more of a Singapore approach. And fundamentally, I get your argument about delivery, but which, like in terms of how to do that, which side you sort of closer to? Because they're two very different approaches, and this metaphor about, well, we're racing a Formula One car, can we rebuild it? I don't think quite works, because with Formula One you can stop and pause and think, okay, now we can rebuild after the race, but fundamentally we can't do that because the civil service needs to keep going. Thanks.
Lady here in the flowery dress.
Genevieve Hall-Allen from The Telegraph. We've recently, James, seen a number of former Conservative MPs join Reform UK, most recently Sir Jake Berry, of course. How do you think that reflects on the party, the Conservative Party, as a whole, and indeed politics, that MPs are changing and switching to this populist party? Is that undermining your message, really?
And then the lady on the left.
Hi, I'm Amy Gannon. I'm an Associate Fellow here at IPPR. You spoke a lot about the need to kind of make difficult decisions. And I guess I'm interested because obviously one only has the ability to kind of make and implement those difficult decisions if the public choose them when you're in power. And I guess at a time when hope is in short supply and some of the kind of more populist options feel kind of more radical and hopeful, how do you lay the groundwork for those difficult decisions with the electorate? Is it kind of political communications? Is it about the quality of information that's in the system? Harry spoke about the media, or is it something like political education that we need? You know, how do we lay the groundwork with the public?
I'll pause there and we'll do another round.
The point I'm making about the civil service is this is what we've got, and any solution which starts with dismantle the system, start again from scratch, can be discounted because that is not a credible starting point for the conversation. Now, should the civil service be smaller and leaner? Absolutely, absolutely. It is grown beyond its useful scale, And it is like a naturally hungry animal that keeps looking for the next thing to devour. Left to its own devices, the civil service would grow and grow and grow. When I was both at the Foreign Office as Foreign Secretary and at the Home Secretary, I kept trying to find projects to turn off. And I kept finding legacy teams of civil servants who were working on ministerial priorities. When I asked which ministerial priority, I discovered that they were ministers like 3 or 4 evolutions ago. So I said, right, stop them, get them off those projects, put them on our core delivery projects. So we are really bad at turning things off. Technology is absolutely going to be useful, and it should make, if used properly, the civil service leaner and more effective and smaller and cheaper. So I totally buy into that. But as I say, the idea that there's this magic wand solution, I think is fundamentally dishonest. And it's often the sales pitch of people that don't really have a credible answer, and therefore they lean on the incredible answer, which is kind of reinvent it on the fly, which I just don't think, I mean, literally no one in the world has ever done that. You know, and whenever someone tries to, whenever you have that revolutionary approach, where the administration is purged, and various people have tried this through history, including, you know, fairly recently, it doesn't work, and people really suffer. And I'm in no mood to see that happen again. With regard to Conservatives going to reform, you say how the effect it has on a party. I think in your question you meant the Conservative Party, but I'm going to answer your question as phrased, and then I'll answer it as intended. I think it's going to be quite an interesting impact on reform as a party, because if their sales pitch is we're not like the old political parties, but they are mainly populated with people from my political party, it's going to be really hard for them to reconcile that sales pitch. So what are they? Are they new? Are they different? Are they exciting? Or are they a repository for, you know, disgruntled former Conservatives? And I think it's going to be hard for them to maintain both angles. Look, it's unsurprising. It is unsurprising that some people who are politically ambitious and remain politically ambitious look at the polling numbers and think their best future is to align themselves to the party that's riding high in the polls. That's unsurprising. I don't think it's smart, I don't think it's right. I think people lose credibility, particularly with people who are Conservative candidates very, very, very recently, who then basically say, oh, you know, the thing that made me realise I wasn't really a Tory was being booted out of office by the electorate. I just don't think that carries as much credibility as they think it does. And how do we make things exciting and dynamic and hopeful? I talked about my political heroes from the past. I'm a Reaganite, and you know, Ronald Reagan was a proper conservative, but you know, optimistic, positive. His sales pitch to the American people is tomorrow can be better than today, and let's work together to make it so. And was rewarded at the ballot box for that sales pitch twice. The second time, really, in a very compelling way. So I don't think it is impossible to be delivery focused. And he delivered huge economic growth, huge standard of living improvements, really, really strong defence, very, very robust foreign policy, all whilst selling a much more positive vision of the future. So I don't think, and you know, he's a great communicator, the great communicator, but he came from, you know, very much an establishment party in US politics. I know US politics is different from UK politics. They basically have this duopoly. But because of their primary process, even within the headline of a particular political party, there are lots of variations in terms of tribe and theme or whatever, and he was successful. And I think that is something we can emulate. Be relentlessly delivery focused, but also be very, very positive about what you're trying to do. This kind of like everything is awful, everything used to be better, and it's only going to get worse. No one wants to hear that. No one wants to hear that. And so yeah, we should be positive and optimistic, but also realistic. And they're not mutually exclusive.
Sarah?
Sky News. You've spoken about what you believe is wrong with Reform and, in fact, all the other parties. But what is the Conservative strategy to beat Reform and make sure people vote for you and not them?
Ladies just here.
Hi, Shani Sharma at LBC Radio. You've spoken this morning about there being no easy fixes and needing to stick with what we've got. But if we look at Kemi Badenoch's position on the ECHR, on net zero, on other issues, don't your words apply to her more than anyone? And are you worried that she is trying to outflank Nigel Farage?
Gentleman in the suit just there.
Chris Friedler from Energy UK. I'm hearing net zero mentioned a few times, so I thought I'd hit in. You talked about unleashing private industry, and private industry is raring to go on net zero. So with that in mind, I guess, what is your perspective on both where the Conservative parliamentary party is on net zero as the front, and perhaps the Conservative Party membership as well?
I do love the way someone else brings up net zero and then I get, I'll work backwards through those questions if I might. Look, we are in an incredibly competitive international race, and we've got to be realistic about where our competitors are, and putting lead in our own saddles at a time when we are in such a competitive race, in whatever way, whether it be net zero, whether it be regulation, whether it be tax, whatever it might be, I think is a really, really bad idea. I think Kemi was absolutely right to look at ways of easing the burden on British business. The point I made in the speech that wasn't about net zero was there is a huge amount of exportable technology that's being developed in the UK in energy production and storage types that could make us wealthy, powerful and safe in decades to come. That is, I think, in no way at odds with Kemi's position. And I also think it harks back to a great British tradition of exporting innovation and making money from that exportation of innovation. That's what the speech was about. And I absolutely stick with that. But the bottom line is we mustn't hamper our ability to compete on the global stage. And we wonder why some of our high-skilled industries are really struggling. It's because their cost of energy is completely out of kilter with their international competitors. And you can do one of two things about it: watch them go under, or do something about it. And Kemi has proposed we do something about it, and she's absolutely right to do so, which I think covers the back half of your question about are we at odds on net zero, which we're not. On the ECHR, there's some policy development that Kemi and the Shadow Attorney General are going through. I want to see how that pans out. One of the points that I would make, however, is that other countries, when I was Home Secretary, I noticed that we had one of the lowest deportation rates amongst our European neighbours. And when I asked, they say, oh, yeah, ECHR. And I'm like, yeah, but the other countries that are much better at deporting criminals than we are, much, much, much better, are also signatories to the ECHR. So what are they doing different to us? Unfortunately, the general election came along before I got a credible answer. But the bottom line is, other signatories to the ECHR are kicking out foreign criminals much more than we are. And other countries that are not signatories to the ECHR are also struggling. So I'm not convinced the ECHR is on its own a silver bullet, particularly if we don't do something about what I worry is a political activism in the legal system, which is trying to rewrite British border and immigration policy through case law rather than through parliamentary law. And I'm uncomfortable about that for all the reasons that I meant. When the British people see that happening, when they see power without accountability, they get angry. And I don't think it's healthy. And in terms of how we beat reform, look, we've seen this happen before when the people are frustrated. So just before I became chairman of the Conservative Party, we had our worst ever results in European Parliament elections. On a national election, we had less than 10% of the vote, and we then went on to win the 2019 general election with one of the largest majorities in recent years. So change happens, and change happens fast. We've seen that because after the 2019 general election, we went to the worst defeat in our history. So the pendulum oscillates very aggressively. Now that is both a challenge and also an opportunity. So at the moment, reform are very, very popular, but now they're running stuff. And running stuff is a lot easier than talking about running stuff. And as I've said, we've now got some examples in local government, and local government is the bit of government that people feel most intimately. This is the bit of government that runs their adult social care, their roads, their schools, their waste collection. And when governments get stuff like that wrong, people notice and people respond. So next door in Essex, the next door local authority to Braintree District Council, they kicked out all the Conservatives election ago. In the lead up to this general election, the only thing the voters were talking about, when I was knocking on the doors, in that new bit of my constituency, they were saying, oh, is Braintree Council going to be doing our bin services now? I said, no, it's a parliamentary boundary change. It's called, the constituency is now called Braintree, but you're still in Uttlesford District Council. And they went, oh. Because Uttlesford District Council, over Christmas, massively screwed up their bin collections. Everybody noticed, everybody was grumpy. Mess about, find out. And the reform councillors who are now running multi-billion-pound public services, if they step up and perform, great, proves my point. If they don't, voters will notice, and they'll be looking for alternatives, and that's what we need to do. We need to make sure that we, once again, are credible alternatives with a genuine plan and some energy and some direction and some mission.
We'll take one quick round. The gentleman in the blue shirt. There's a microphone.
Hi, Peter Walker from the Guardian. You make a compelling case for voters being turned off by people who offer easy answers and promise things that can't be done. Is there not an argument that Conservatives have done that in the past? Brexit was arguably something where a kind of outside group was blamed for everything that was going wrong in Britain. That turned out not to be the case, and now voters don't particularly think Brexit went well. And more recently, under Rishi Sunak's government, there was a pledge to stop the votes. And the scheme that was intended for that was very, very clearly never going to work. Do you think the Conservative Party has a bit of culpability in this populist rise also?
I'll take two more. Gentleman on the left over there.
Hi James, you've spoken about how you got into politics to do things. I just wondered what you want to do over the next 3-4 years or so. Is it potentially return to the front bench, stand for London Mayor, or just remain happy on the back benches giving speeches?
And then the gentleman just here in the blue tie.
Hello James, David Williamson Express. One of the great challenges, of course, is that a lot of people in the Conservative Party are looking at the polls and thinking, help, am I going to lose my seat? What do you say to MPs who can see that their constituents are excited about Nigel Farage and are wondering, should they go across? And also, as someone who knows the 2019 election winner Boris Johnson very well, does it frustrate you that someone like him is not actually on the pitch at the moment?
Peter, in the speech I made the point that Brexit was the canvas upon which so many people projected their arguments and ideas. It was a Rorschach test for people in British politics. So it became whatever people wanted it to be. So for some, it was all about immigration. For some, it was all about international trade. For some, it was all about sovereignty. For some, it was all about accountability. But the fact is that when the question was put by a modest majority, but nevertheless by a majority of the people that voted, they said, this system is not working for me. And once they said that, we were duty-bound to listen. Now, I'm frustrated that a lot of the opportunities of Brexit weren't seized. Some of that was because of inertia, some of that was because shortly after we left the European Union, we went straight into COVID, war in Ukraine, huge amount of disruption. And it is absolutely right for us to recognise that the promise of Brexit, for a whole load of reasons, and not just because of government decisions and action, the promise of Brexit, for many people that voted Brexit, wasn't delivered in the way that they wanted. And there's one or two things we can do about that. I would suggest that perhaps your paper and many of your readers, their response is, I told you so. Yeah, not particularly useful. I think our response is, well, let's learn from that and make sure, as I say, we are tighter in our definitions of what we promise, and we are more relentlessly focused on delivery. But in the answer to the question you didn't quite ask, I would do it again in a heartbeat, because it was about accountability. When people said to me, why can't this thing change? And we said, oh, that's a decision for the European Union. And they said, right, who do I vote for to make it stop? And you say, well, there isn't anyone to vote for to make it stop. It's just the way it is. They were rightfully frustrated by that. And even though it hurt, even though, for example, immigration, which was a significant part of Brexit, even though that was in significant part one of the reasons why we lost the general election, it was still the right thing to do, because at the 2024 general election, there was no one else that could be blamed. It was incumbent upon the British government to do something about it. I started the process of doing something about it, and had I had longer in government, I would have achieved more. But it was clear where the buck stopped, and as painful though that is, for me, that is the heart of representative democracy. The voters knew who to blame, and that is, as I say, it was painful, but it was right. James, what do I want to do? Look, I got into where you got? I got into politics to do stuff. I realised that in opposition, it is much harder to get things done. Really, really hard. In fact, in opposition, you can't really get things done. At best, you can corral, bully, steer, coerce the government into getting stuff done. And actually, Kemi's been really successful with regard to things like the grooming gangs, with regard to the U-turn the government did on winter fuel payments. I think she's going to get a win, hopefully, on the farming tax. But ultimately, you can only make someone else do so. I find that unbelievably frustrating. I like being in government. I don't like being in opposition, which is why I'm clear that I will play my part in helping to get Conservatives back into government at every level of government. Exactly what I do next, I've forced a discipline on myself, which is not to jump at something. I ran for leader, I didn't get it. I reconciled myself to that, and I promised myself that I would spend some time thinking about exactly what I would do next. I know everyone will write into that, cleverly refuses to discount ... Nothing I can do about that. You're going to write what you're going to write. But the simple fact of the matter is, I am focused on what I've always focused on, which is getting a Conservative government at every level to serve the British people. And that's my mission, that's my flag in the sand, and exactly what role I play, I'm forcing myself to take some time to think about. And Conservatives who are worried about losing their seats. Worrying about losing a seat is a really, really important part of the democratic process. So it is right. And look, I've always, even in the good years, I've always had that little spectre, as every elected politician should, about, you know, what if they don't re-elect me? I had that when I had a majority of, what, 24,000? I'll be honest with you, that spectre is closer and larger now that my majority is 3,500. But the reason that every elected politician should be a little bit scared of losing their seat is because it forces you to do the right thing. It forces you to engage with the community. It forces you to campaign. It forces you to listen to their concerns. It forces you to find ways of addressing their concerns. This is healthy. This is how it should be. So a little bit of fear of losing your seat is absolutely the right thing. But what I would also do, what I would also say, is there is no point in being despondent, and there is definitely no point in being fatalistic about this. You know, the prediction of the demise of the Conservative Party and the Tory Party have happened a number of times before. And we are the oldest and most successful political movement in human history for a reason. We adapt, we evolve, we fight back. I'm reminded, and this will be my last words, I'm reminded of Rome after the Battle of Cannae. Rome is not defeated until Rome chooses itself to be defeated. And we choose not to be defeated, and therefore we will fight back. Thank you.
Just a few thank yous to run us off. Firstly, thank you so much to James for joining us today. Really provocative, interesting speech and a robust defence of kind of pragmatic, democratic, responsive politics. So thank you for that. Thank you to my team who've organised today, particularly Ollie and Vicky and Liam. Really, really amazing event as always. And thank you to all of you for coming. We would love to host you back here at IPPR again, so keep a look out. We've got lots coming up, including Ed Davey tomorrow. I'm sure many of you want to join us for that. So thank you very much. Have a great day.